Welcome back, everybody, to Missed Apex Formula E podcast. We are all charged up and ready to go. It is a brand new year, but we are still the same old Missed Apex Formula E podcast. We had a lovely month where we were sort of just waiting patiently to come back, and here we are back with Mexico City. She is iconic to watch, and she produced something quite interesting this time around. Joining, as always, is partner in crime, Chris Stevens.
Hello, Macy. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Do you have any resolutions you want to share?
My resolutions is to do more of Missed Apex Formula E podcasting, obviously, and follow the series much more closely because I missed like the whole back end of last season. So I don't want that to happen again.
Absolutely. More Missed Apex, more Formula E. What more could you want? Well,
Exactly.
let us tell you. Some Brad Philpott. How are you doing today, Brad?
I'm good. That was a civilized time of day, wasn't it? Well, for us, maybe not for you, Christina, but I enjoyed that. That was some good entertainment. A proper race this time.
It was very fun. Do you have any New Year's resolutions you're excited about?
To help you guys draw a little bit closer to the horrible two-wheeled Missed Apex podcast that's out there, because I think it's an absolute travesty that you're lagging behind the MotoGP one.
It's
Oh.
not our fault because there hasn't been Formula E for 6 months.
Well, I'm gonna try and help you get a bit closer. And if we get races like this throughout the year, which we probably will with the way the new attack mode works, then hopefully you'll do it.
It's definitely been promising 2 races in a row where we've had multiple things to be incredibly excited about. It has not felt 2 times in a row now that it's just been great to watch. I feel like I've been keeping the eye on track and very, very excited to talk to all of you now about this. Now, before we get into discussing what we saw on track, I'm going to give Brad 2 seconds. Are you ready to say and gloat that you were right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I saw something which I thought was relatively obvious in the race and just said it in our text chat. And I'm going to just claim that means I'm really good at predicting Formula E strategy and how the races are going to pan out. But basically, during that race, we saw loads of different strategies play out, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But I saw a couple of people lurking doing certain things. One was Jake Dennis, and I was pleased to see him move forward, although ultimately it was a little bit too much of a task to get on the podium in the end. And the other one was Oliver Rowland. And regardless of whether a safety car came out, he was looking pretty strong. And with 6 minutes remaining, when all the people ahead of him had nothing left at all, whatever shook out, it was looking good. And then when that safety car did come out, and I know I'm skipping ahead, it could have gone either way for him. And I just chose the right one.
It was really exciting to watch Roland. And that was the big thing, was watching all of the attack mode timings. And now that it actually makes such a big difference, I feel like this is where we're going to be paying so much attention, is who takes which timing of attack mode. And it's going to become so important. And of course, you have that unpredictability of when safety cars are going to come out. But I find myself now staring so much more frequently at the timing and how much everybody has left. And that's incredibly exciting.
It's definitely, I think, become more beneficial to use your attack mode later in the race. Of course, the risk you run with that is that you're going to get a safety car. And for a moment, it looked like Ollie had just had some of the worst timing possible because he had just taken his second attack mode, and it was the big one as well. He didn't do the 4-4 split. He did the 2-6. So he was going to have a really big push in the closing stages of that race. To try and close down the gap that the top 3 had built up and then try and pass them. So when the safety car came out, it was like, well, it's very unlikely that this is going to get cleared up in the next 6 minutes, isn't it? Especially because the safety car runs so slowly around the track. They crawl around. It's like they're speed limited rather than pace limited, if that makes sense. So luckily, it came in when he had a couple of minutes left on it, and I sort of checked the timing when he went over the timing line, which is when you're allowed to start overtaking. 1 minute and 15 left on his attack mode, and he didn't even need the 4 minute and 15. 45 seconds it took him to go from P4 to P1. And yeah, you can say, oh, he benefited from the safety car and all that. But the strategy of using attack mode later worked really well for him. And talk about making use of the opportunities that are presented to you. I don't know too many drivers who could just carve their way through the field like that, because it wasn't as simple as it was in Sao Paulo, where there was literally no defense against a car in attack mode. You were able to cover off moves, and Jake Dennis touched on this really well just before the start of the race, which was that when you defend, you wash out wide, and the guy behind gets the undercut, you still generally have the inside line for the next corner as well. So, and because there's shorter straights, they can't use that extra power as much. And you think, okay, well, the front straight's pretty long, but they're coasting like halfway down it. So they're not using the power. And yeah, Ollie just did such an amazing job to just slice his way through the field.
I think what made it even more impressive was he was the only one in that front group that was kind of running solo. The other cars he was fighting against had a teammate at least somewhere nearby. I know Muller wasn't right up there with Dennis, but he certainly helped him get there. And then obviously the two Porsches were together, trying to work together. But maybe being on his own played into his hands, because where Porsche were trying to, obviously pacify both of their drivers, they need to make them feel like they've both got a shot of winning. Although they tried to operate as a pair, you could hear that. I think it was Da Costa at one point was getting a little bit touchy, or maybe it was Verlon, or maybe it was both of them. But obviously Roland was only there for himself and could just do whatever the other cars weren't doing. He could just take his attack mode when they were effectively defenseless, especially after being bunched up by the safety car.
So Roland is kind of flying the flag solo for the Nissan powered cars. And it's going to sound really harsh when I say this, especially considering McLaren was on the podium in Sao Paulo. But obviously, the two Porsches are much more closer than ever. You've got the Andrettis in there as well, and they have worked together in the past. There has been friction between the two teams as well, but they have been able to utilize, each other being there. It's the same with the Jaguar cars as well. For instance, how they won in Monaco, the two works cars working so close together. But Ollie has definitely claimed himself to be the top driver in a Nissan car. And you look, he was the only other Nissan. He was the only Nissan car in the points today. So yeah, he didn't have his teammate to back him up. He didn't have Muller, to create big gaps and like, oh, block this guy, and then, oh, if you can't get through on that guy, let me back through. He was doing it himself.
And he definitely benefited from the other two teams getting into it with each other. There were how many laps where the only commentary and the only point of discussion were what were the Porsches doing, what were Andretti doing, and how they were fighting against each other. And you just saw Roland waiting in the background, being patient, and kind of having that understanding of my moment will come. They may be working together, but they're also only fighting each other, and kind of forgetting that I'm lurking back here. And then when the moment of opportunity came, he was just ready to seize it. It was fabulous.
And this affirms to me as well that Nissan has definitely made a huge improvement with their Gen 3 Evo powertrain. If you're unfamiliar with the FE regs, when we moved into Gen 3, all the manufacturers made new powertrains. Now that we've started Gen 3 Evo, it's another new powertrain cycle. And Nissan seem to be the ones who've made the biggest leap forward. We've talked about the last 2 years have largely been about Jaguar versus Porsche, certainly in terms of the championship. Occasionally you get Nissan winning a race or Stellantis winning a race as well. But now it seems like a proper three manufacturer fight between Porsche, Jaguar and Nissan. And, they showed us that pace. They had an inkling of it in Sao Paulo as well, but there was the technical infraction that caused all of their cars to end up getting penalties that ultimately saw that not coming through in terms of the actual result, but the pace was fundamentally there. And I think Ollie had the pace to go for pole position as well. He sort of boo-booed his semi-final run ever so slightly. He definitely could have been in the final and probably could have had that fight for pole position as well. So they've got a really good car in all areas.
Yeah, it's been really great to see. Oh, let's bounce over now and concentrate on the Porsche versus Andretti fight, because that that took up so much of the time. And it was masterful to see, really fun to see them and make which decisions that they did. Because Porsche were trying to make a wall at one point to sort of just prevent Andretti from going through, but Andretti were prioritizing making a gap to get that attack mode in. Do we think that there's one of those two strategies that's going to be more beneficial in the long run, or do we see them kind of bouncing back and forth between the two of those?
You kind of have to sacrifice your team's championship, really, because let's be honest, Nico Muller was a sacrificial lamb in that race, wasn't he? Where he was not only, when he got up to fourth eventually, he then started backing the pack up a little bit to allow the top three to escape. But he also was disrupting the cars in front of him, trying to get up to Jake's car. And you saw even at one point, he passed Jake to then have a go at Jev, I think it was, as well. And as soon as he realized that, I can't quite get around Jev, I'll just wave Jake straight back by. Completely yielded to his teammate. And I think even as well, Porsche employed him to help Da Costa for his attack mode, because when Porsche's little wall of defense didn't quite go to plan, and Da Costa ended up getting shuffled back through the pack, and actually Ollie gets my vote for one of the best Formula E overtakes I've ever seen, which was like passing him in the middle of the Peraltada, which is unbelievable. But Da Costa gets shuffled back. He's straight on the radio going, "Help me now!" And the car behind him was the Porsche customer Nico Muller. So yeah, surely you just say, "Hey, would you mind just you're doing a bit of blocking anyway? Do you mind just doing a little bit more of that so that Antonio can take his attack mode, please?"
Yeah, it was fabulous to see. What else I find really fun and just interesting about the Andrettis this time around is that they started out not quite far back, but far enough back. Dennis was in seventh, Muller was in 11th. So they not only had to get up towards that front to even be able to fight together with the Porsches, but they had to go through traffic first.
So maybe Chris can answer this one for me, because although I'm a Formula E fan and I try and follow it closely, there are some things I miss out on. Are Andretti on identical spec to the factory Porsche currently?
You have to be.
And therefore, with that in mind,
the Cooper Kiro team, they're running an older specification.
Okay, so with that in mind, then Andretti need to sort out their qualifying, because Porsche have obviously been very strong in the first two rounds. And the fact that Dennis had to come from so far back, even with a rear gunner of Muller, or sometimes a front gunner helping him out and dragging everyone back, he kind of ran out of, I know his tires were a little bit shot by the end as well, but he had to use up more minutes of his attack mode getting himself up to the front. And then obviously he suffered from that later on. Had he started in the top three, that wouldn't have really been so much of an issue. So maybe it is on Andretti, who've kind of gone up against Porsche, as a competitor completely on equal terms in the past. It's maybe up to them to pull their finger out a little bit and get the qualifying sorted out, because we're very early in the season. And, even just looking at the standings now, a driver who scored no points at round one is now sitting second in the championship. So it's still all completely to play for. And Dennis is up there, looking reasonably strong too, albeit, 20 odd points behind the leader. We know how Formula E goes, and we know how these things can change so quickly and so dramatically in a season, like with Da Costa last year, for example. So if Andretti can sort out their qualifying, I think this whole Andretti maybe helping out the factory Porsche team, like you're suggesting Muller might have done today, that's got to stop, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not something you're going to see every single weekend. I think it was because Muller was already employed in that role for Jake anyway. And, the Andretti drivers have called upon the Works drivers to help them out as well when Jake was going for the championship in London a couple of years ago as well. So not that actually ended up coming to anything, but the option's there for them. They do have a synergy between them. I think obviously Andretti have got an identical car to the Porsche Works team, who, safe to say, absolutely nailed it in qualifying with a front row lockout. but we've got to remember we've got a completely different tire for this season. It's a way softer compound. The track was like really quite cold during qualifying and very green as well because there was overnight rain as well. So I think there is a lot to be said about getting the tire in the sweet spot. And I know we talk about this in Formula One all the time. People go, "Oh, I'm so fed up of hearing about tires," but it's just the same like across all motorsport. So yeah, maybe that was the difference, or maybe it's something in the setup, something in the software. Maybe it's safe to say though, when it comes to the race, they're definitely still on par with the works team.
Something that's nice to see is because you've got this softer compound and because the cars are performing at a higher level this year, things which traditionally might not have been so much of a factor in Formula E because the pace of the cars just wasn't that fast or the compound was just too hard, now actually matter a bit. So setting up the car to get the most from the tires, or I know obviously that's a thing that has always been important, but so much more so when you've got a tire which is closer to the performance of a slick, where it can drop out of a window very easily. It's stickier when it's fresh. You saw Taylor Barnard today got the fastest lap, well, certainly the fastest of the drivers in the top 10. And that was because he took his attack mode earlier in the race when the tires were fresher and he was able to extract that performance from the tire. So that kind of thing, I still think there's a lot of scope during the season for teams to get more, even though the car isn't completely new, it's new in some ways. So I think there's scope for teams to still improve their understanding, and the order might change from teams that work the tires better.
Like tire wear is 100% a thing now. Like you saw the marbles around the Perros harder as well, because it's a softer compound and because the front powertrain has now been activated. So it's now pushing the front tires as well with power, not just through like the steering. And of course, you know all about that, Brad, having driven a front wheel drive racing car for many years of your career as well, that you can chew through the front tires doing that.
Yeah, and it makes complete sense, obviously, that that's the tire that Dennis was talking about being the limiting factor, because all of a sudden this softer tire is being pushed harder and having to do some of the accelerating some of the time. So yeah, I like to see it, and I'm enjoying the differences in what is essentially a really similar looking car to the previous year. I'm really enjoying just how different it is to watch the racing this year. And that's in terms of the way the cars perform, but also the way the attack mode works, which is kind of how it should have always been. Like, it's actually an advantage to have attack mode remaining, or when, to be in attack mode, rather than it being seen as something that you need to get out of the way. That was always a bit disappointing. I know you will have covered that before on the previous pods, because this isn't the first one of this season, but watching as a spectator, I really enjoy seeing the dynamic of the way the race unfolds now. It's much more, it seems a lot more as it is intended.
I also really appreciate how we went from Sao Paulo to Mexico City. Sao Paulo a bit more of a street track, and Mexico City a bit more standard. I mean, it is a purpose-built track a lot more. And so we're seeing just such a difference in how attack mode is going to behave right at the start of the season, from having different track layouts, from having different constraints. And that's really fun. It's giving you a good impression of what the variety is that we're going to be seeing through the season. And now I'm trying to think of all the track layouts and all the different circuits we're going to be going to, and trying to imagine, all right, this is how these locations are different. These are the type of strategies we might be seeing. These are the considerations that we have to have. It's really going to be an exciting season because of that.
100%. You see the difference in how it worked out, the attack mode specifically in Sao Paulo versus in Mexico City. And they're two very different types of circuit, and there's no such thing really as a typical Formula E track anymore. Because you think about the next race in Jeddah, which is a street circuit, but feels more like a permanent circuit because in many ways it is, and it's not on, actual city roads, is it? It's on proper asphalt. And it is, it's a revised version of the Formula One layout, but still going to have plenty of those fast sections in it where they can utilize that power. So I wonder if it will start to fit slightly more in the middle between the two races we've seen so far. But what attack mode did in this race is that it wasn't as it was in Sao Paulo, like foot down, blow by, free DRS overtake. Thank you very much. Because they couldn't really use the power down that straight because it wasn't long enough, they were having to do it in the middle bit of the lap where it's all traction zones and doing lunges on the inside and trying it at the chicane and then trying it going into the stadium section. That to me is much more entertaining to watch than the DRS-esque, just like foot down, blow by, absolutely no chance of defending it whatsoever. Because the moves like that Roland did, for example, were all inventive. So that, in that one lap where he went from fourth to first, that's something you're actually going to remember, and not anything we saw in Sao Paulo, basically.
Yeah, it's so much about getting your car in the right position so you can use that power. Much more exciting. Absolutely. Now, although we saw two teams making great advantages and getting pretty solid results, we also had Jaguar, who we typically have higher expectations than what we saw this time around, which was quite forgettable, all things considered. They had a decent qualifying, made it up to the duels, and were against each other, so only one could go through. But then they lost a number of positions. Well, Gunter stayed where he was, but still, fifth and sixth, and really not seeing them too much in the fight overall was certainly disappointing.
Yeah, so this really all sort of stemmed back to a slight boo-boo they had in qualifying where three Jaguar cars, so Nick Cassidy in the works car and the two Envisions, Sebastian Buemi and Robin Freins, Jaguar customer, of course, had the latest in the long line of Formula E unheard of in other series penalties, which is, to explain it very briefly, when you homologate the powertrain, there is a certain throttle map that is homologated with it that says when the throttle was in this position, this is how much power is being delivered to the rear wheels. It was outside of that margin. In fact, it wasn't more power, it was less power, in fact. So it was in no way a pace advantage, but because it's not what was homologated, they get chucked out of qualifying for it. And they're very lucky that it didn't happen on Mitch Evans' car. As well, because it looked like for a second he was also going to fall afoul of this same regulation. But then he ended up whacking into the back of Muller anyway. And so Jaguar come out of here with nil points.
Wow. That's disappointing.
So what do we think of the Evans accident near the end that brought out that second safety car? Because you could see as his car was being recovered that he had broken steering. And so it was always going to be something had touched him or he had touched something on his front end. We didn't get to see why until after the safety car had ended. And it turned out he essentially just drove into the back of the car in front. But in mitigation, the car in front, which was Muller, was that what you were saying, Chris?
I think it was, yeah.
Didn't accelerate or accelerated very, very slowly out of that corner. I don't know why. I don't know if he was deliberately holding anyone up or if there was some kind of issue or if he made a mistake. But how much of the blame do you lay on Evans for that?
Well, that's a really unfair question. So I think it was it was Muller, and he'd just been roughed up, hadn't he, a little bit in the middle of that chicane. So I don't know if that's related to why he was moving slowly out of the corner, but I don't know. You, Brad, as a racing driver, how much are you relying on the car in front to do what you would expect it to do, which is to accelerate out of the corner? You wouldn't expect him to just not, be moving at barely any rate at all. So I can kind of forgive Mitch for doing what he did.
Yeah, so essentially you really are generally relying, if you're racing closely with a bunch of cars, you are relying on the car in front doing something you expect. And your range of expectations can include them not getting a great exit, but there's a limit to what would be a realistic lack of acceleration. And I think this was the wrong side of that for Evans. He probably did back off slightly or steer early to try and avoid the accident, but it was so out of his expectation window. Muller slowed down or didn't accelerate to such a degree that Evans didn't have time to react. And you have to make the assumption the cars around you are going to do expected things all the time. Otherwise, you'd just always be losing time and driving slowly. You've got to expect that the car next to you isn't just going to turn across on you if you've got an overlap. You've got to expect that the car behind you is going to brake correctly. Otherwise, you'd start braking really early to make sure they slowed down early. You have to assume your competitors are going to act within this certain set of parameters. So I think I also let him off the hook, but I'd need to see it on board and know exactly what happened. And I don't think we've had a great view of it yet, but that's what it looked like to me.
There's one of those that will come out like next week, and it'll be like in the onboards compilation or in the team radio compilation, which I do recommend you go and watch. You do learn a lot about Formula E watching those videos. But I was thinking as well, I don't know if he was in attack mode or not, but with there being such a difference in acceleration now as well, your sort of margin to react to that kind of moment becomes less because you're accelerating so much quicker.
I'm not sure if he was in attack mode either. I mean, you can generally know whether the cars around you are in attack mode or not, and the team should inform you. But I think it was even more of a kind of discrepancy than that would take into account. But you're right though, these cars and lots of top racing cars, but especially electrically powered ones, accelerate from a very low speed very, very quickly. So if the car in front of you doesn't do that, then obviously you've got a very small amount of time to react. But there were a few other incidents that were, or near incidents, which involved some potentially controversial racecraft that I'd like to talk about if we have a moment.
You have a list ready to go?
I think it was mainly De Vries, and was it Bird that was complaining about him and how he was defending like a madman? I think that was the words. And then we got to see later on, I think he was defending strongly from Barnard, and Bird saw that, and then Bird got a taste of that himself when he was up to the back of De Vries in his own attack mode. And I think the complaint came from the late defense that De Vries was making. So Bird would get a run and be looking like he was going to slot down the inside, but before the overlap happened, or certainly this is what it looked like from the angles we saw, De Vries would then dive to the inside. And I can see why Bird didn't like that, but I can also see why you could argue it's perfectly legitimate way of defending. And from my point of view, if there is nothing next to you and the car behind that's attacking hasn't already committed to the point where they can't back out of it, then you're within your rights to drive at any point across the width of the track. And the fact that Bird didn't crash into him, or the fact there was no contact, means that I'd say De Vries probably did judge it just about right. But as an attacking driver, it's certainly annoying, and I would moan about it on the radio too.
It's kind of the American rule, isn't it, about what blocking is, which is like moving in reaction to the car behind, which I think you could say De Vries was doing, because if he's seeing Sam move and then he moves, then that is by the American rule book anyway, blocking. And I think a lot of drivers will complain about that anyway, no matter which side of the pond they're on.
And you're right, that is a specific rule in some series, but I don't think there was no penalty, was there? I don't even think there was a warning. No. So I think there was no crime to answer for as far as Formula E rulebook goes.
No.
But
what was the penalty that Bird got? Do we remember what that was?
It was 5 second penalty for going into Mortara.
At which point? I don't recall seeing that at all on the replay.
There was a skirmish in the hairpin involving De Vries as well. So he had De Vries alongside him. I think it was a bit of a lunge, and then Sam, maybe as a result of it as well, maybe he was slightly distracted, got into the back of Edo, and Edo had a bit of a slide. And there was absolutely zero consequence to the incident whatsoever. And for me, was just kind of the typical thing you see in pack racing. And I know we've said on the Formula One show a lot, you don't penalize the consequence of the incident, you penalize the crime. But for me, I saw nothing in that was penalty worthy. I felt like that was very harsh on Sam.
It seems so.
I didn't see it back in close enough detail to really comment on it, but I think I felt the same, because I also watched that skirmish and I didn't see anything there which I thought deserved a penalty. Formula E cars do bounce off each other quite a lot. Sam Bird isn't afraid to get stuck in and use the limit of contact that you can generally get away with in Formula E, which is significant, compared to a lot of series, it's more like touring car racing when it comes to how much you lean on other cars, particularly now they've beefed up the front end slightly.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think I also agree. It was harsh when you see how much other stuff happens in a Formula E race that he was the only one that got that penalty. What about the contact with Tictum at the beginning? Was there a penalty for whoever spun Tictum around?
Don't think there was, no. Didn't see it pop up anyway. I think because they were having their own little battle, weren't they? Because it was sort of two cars going side by side, then one of them just tagged. In fact, probably if it was the car in the middle, then he wouldn't have. I was Van Dorn.
If I remember it correctly, and I'm not Tictum's biggest fan by any means, but
Yeah.
he was exiting one of the tight corners at the end of the lap and was just spun around by a car that harpooned his rear end.
Well, I feel like, yeah, if I remember it correctly as well, Van Dorn was in the middle of the side. He had a car on his inside, so couldn't exactly leave more space, and then ended up hitting Tictum as a result. This is not like the Formula One show where we've all seen the incidents a billion times before we go and dive into them into very meticulous detail. This is very much just on vibes. But also, Macy, can you say it again that Bird's penalty was harsh so we don't get accused of British bias?
It was definitely harsh. And I think the fact that the broadcast didn't even have replays ready to go because they probably judged it to not be anything worth taking the time to make a highlight of is very telling. Like, they also know what to look out for and what would probably be something that's going to be talked about later. And they didn't have anything ready to go when they announced that Sam Bird got a 5-second penalty. But the other incident, when it was the start of the race, lap one, and I looked in my notes and it was Hughes. That was the Maserati that was involved in that,
Okay.
yes. So during that incident, lap one, of course they're going to do replays of it. But again, because it's lap one, how many times do you not give out penalties and excuse it because it's lap one?
All the time.
All the time. If I had a nickel for every time, I'd have a lot
Every
of
time.
nickels.
Just whilst we're talking about penalties, I didn't see what the result of Degrassi not having enough time to use his attack mode was. I'm sure we heard about that at some point, but on the results, I don't see any kind of penalty.
Yeah, so well, that's because the race finished like an hour ago. But it was the same for both the Envisions as well. And so this is what we're talking about. When we talk about leaving it late for the attack mode, you risk the safety car. This is exactly what happened to Degrassi, France, and Buemi. But they will pick up, I think, a 30-second time penalty, something like that. It's big. It's the equivalent of a drive-through penalty, basically.
Not something you want to be getting. Did we hear any radio messages confirming why they waited so long to take?
I can only imagine they were just hoping to try and charge through the pack because these are the Envisions, especially. They were out of position because they were part of the Jaguar throttle mapping issue in qualifying, and so I think it was just a strategy to try and carve through the pack later in the race when other people have spent the attack mode, and then they can come charging through, a bit like what Ollie did, but they left it slightly too late. And actually, speaking of, for Robin Freins, no points on the board because he didn't even start in Sao Paulo, which is astonishing to say because he should be a championship contender.
This seems like quite a glaring and obvious error to make. So I'm struggling to see how a team can leave it too late because you know how long is left in the race and you know you have to take this attack mode. I was seeing these guys with time remaining, thinking this is getting really tight now. Like, just do it. There can be a safety car at any point. And are you allowed to actually drive through the attack mode zone under safety car?
No,
you're not actually allowed. So that's always a risk then. So maybe they just thought we're out of the points at the moment anyway. We need to take maximum risk for maximum reward because otherwise we're going to get 0 points anyway.
So when attack mode was first introduced, you could do it under safety car. What we ended up seeing was you'd have safety car restart and then just everyone would drive through attack mode. So it was a bit moot at that point.
But that was back when it wasn't an advantage to have it. So now I would. In
the very, very, very early days of it, it was sort of half and half, depended on the track, I think. But also what you would get when you get some circuits, you lose way more time than you do at like in the Mexico City track, for example. You barely lose anything. It's probably one of, if not the smallest delta loss to take attack mode of the whole season, because you're in a slow corner anyway. So you're not losing that much time. But say like the old Diria track, for example, you'd have a situation where you'd be under safety car, not allowed to overtake. Car in front of you would go through attack mode, and you, without even trying, would overtake that car. And it'd be like, well, am I allowed to overtake? He was going all the way over there. And now I've got a penalty for overtaking under the safety car. It was a big mess. So they ended up just getting rid of the ability to take it under safety car at all. And I think maybe they had planned to do it on the lap that last safety car came out, and they just got it wrong. But like you said, yeah, probably maximum risk for maximum reward. But it ended up not working anyway because they didn't even finish inside the top 10.
But still, like leaving the full 8 minutes, that seems like the wildest risk. It's one thing to do the 2 and the 6, or even the 4 and the 4, and to leave the secondary of them
I think it was the 6, wasn't
all
it?
the way at the end. No, one of them had up until
Wall.
one of the really late laps. They had a full 8 minutes left. I think it was Degrassi.
Okay, yeah, that is a
He
bit of
got
a
like
boo-boo then, isn't it?
2/3 into the race and still had 8 minutes left. That was the mind-boggling one.
Interesting. Okay,
Hmm.
I might look into that later on, because the only other time I can think of it happening was when there was a red flag
Hmm.
and they didn't restart the race. So I think it was Jev ended up getting a huge penalty for not using the attack mode, or all of the attack mode. I think he hadn't taken it or something.
Yeah, bad luck versus bad strategy, though. That it feels like such a big difference in that case.
Oh yeah, always like yeah. There's bad luck and there's bad strategy.
And let us never get the two confused. Oh, let's take a minute to talk about Lola, because they're bright and colorful, so they're so easy to see on track, and they totally don't remind me of IKEA branding. But I feel like it's so frustrating watching Degrassi be there and having a car that really just can't do much.
Well, they seem to have some pace in qualifying, but some sort of hardware issue on Degrassi's car that meant he couldn't really utilize that pace. And I think we've got to remember as well, App's running the team, but it's with completely new equipment, basically. So I feel like they're learning a lot about, how to make a car, basically, how to make a good car, anyway. I think it's a really steep learning curve when you consider who they're up against. Like, these are very seasoned teams now out there with very refined packages. So I think they're doing what they can with what they've got.
I don't have any comments on Lola. They just didn't feature in my race viewing, apart from seeing that Degrassi had not enough time to take his attack mode. So that's my only Lola contribution, and they do look like IKEA.
Some assembly required in this case as well. But it was absolutely phenomenal of a race to watch. Do we have a highlight? Does everybody have a favorite moment from the race?
I've already said mine. The Roland overtake on Da Costa for second in the Parotada.
Yeah, my favorite moment was absolutely clearly Muller doing an obvious holding up job in the final sector to allow Dennis's strategy to play out. It just was really good teamwork. I'd have been very annoyed if I was the cars behind, because he nearly stopped in one of the last corners. But yeah, it worked, and it meant that my favorite driver, a bit of a Jake Dennis stan here, was able to then capitalize maximally, and I think he finished as high as he could finish with the way everything played out.
I'm gonna go ahead and say not necessarily a favorite moment, but favorite overall was just Taylor Barnard having another pretty stellar weekend. He, last time out, got a podium. This time around, went from P19 into 10th. So overall, quite solid for it being his first season, and fastest lap, yes. So overall, solid showing from him.
Can I sort of spare a thought for Antonio Felix da Costa as well? Because he was the quickest driver this weekend. I think he should have been on pole position as well. I think he's freely admitted that because he was quicker than Pascal through the quarterfinals, through the semis, and then just made like one little mistake in the final that cost him the pole to Pascal. And we sort of thought it was going to be a bit between the pair of them for the win. And for a lot of the time it was as well, until Ollie came storming through with his own ideas. And he's narrowly missed out on a win again, as he did in Sao Paulo. And I think if you add up the margin, his margin of loss basically between the two races, it adds up to less than a second. So he's been really good, but just a little bit unfortunate maybe in these first two races to just miss out on two wins like that.
Adding fuel to the fire. Maybe next time around we see him go absolutely madman on it and win.
Maybe. But it goes to show how far he's come. Because you remember a year ago, he was really struggling with the car and had been since he joined Porsche. And then second half of last season, just bam, took off and mounted a title challenge. And he seems to be firing on all cylinders again. What's the electric equivalent we can say of firing on all
spinning
cylinders?
on all
Rotors.
What's the inside of a motor called?
I don't know.
Commutator. I think that's what the inside of an electric motor is called.
Inverters are zapping at full capacity. Oh no. We're no Shakespeare's, but he's doing good is the gist of the conversation.
So let me just give one additional point we've not covered yet, but as a spectator, it's something I would like addressed. I know we have had seasons in Formula E before where half the grid looked the same. I think, was it black and white? It was like every car looked black and white at some point.
In Gen 2, it was very clear there were sort of 2 or 3 color combos that looked good on that car, and everyone had picked them.
So I think if you're going to run at similar ends of the grid, you shouldn't be allowed to have cars which basically look the same. Was it the Nissans and the Andretti's are pretty similar. Luckily, Andretti's got a lot of white on the side. And you've obviously got the Maseratis and the Porsches, weirdly, which aren't the same color, but on the TV cameras, they just look like a kind of darkish blue to me. So fortunately for us as viewers, the Porsches are the ones at the front. So they're not generally in the same bit of track, but I'm not a fan. They're all the same shape. The cars are all the same shape, obviously. Yeah. So having them that similar, not a fan. Anyway, that's my spectator quote.
Hey, the Stellantis, I'm going to mention Stellantis because we haven't mentioned them all podcast long. They finished 5th, 6th, and 7th today. So that is a good points haul between DS Penske and one of the Maseratis in the points.
Not bad at all. And now we have that third championship to look forward to.
Yeah, Manufacturers' Cup.
Ooh, Cup. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's going Porsche's way.
just maybe, perhaps. Oh, and we will keep on watching the rest of the season to see indeed whose way it goes. Thank you both for joining today. It was really fun of a race to watch. Really great chat to have with the both of you, and we will be back for another race review after our first doubleheader of the season, which will be at Jeddah. Very fun, very exciting. Twice the racing and twice the chit chat.
5 weeks' time, that is. But I'm sure we'll find excuses to fill that 5-week gap, maybe with hopefully a couple of interviews, maybe a mailbag show or something.
Get ready. There will be things. So follow everybody here. It'll be down in the show descriptions. We've had Bradley Philpott. We've had Chris Stevens. I'm still Cristina Lee Mace. And thank you for joining us all today.